The body of Dr. Kwesi Mensah sat slumped over his desk, his fingers stiff against the blood-smeared wood. His throat had been slit with such precision that there was little splatter, just a slow, fatal leak, soaking into his crisp white shirt. The study smelled of iron and ink, an eerie combination that unsettled even the most hardened officers on the scene. Detective Zainab Okoro stood at the entrance, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The air was still, undisturbed except for the unnatural silence that death left in its wake. The lamp on the desk flickered, casting long shadows across the bookshelves. Dr. Mensah had been a man of intellect, of reason. His home was a reflection of his mind, organized, disciplined, untouched by chaos. And yet, chaos had found him. "What do we have?" she asked, stepping deeper into the room. Officer Malik, a stout man with a perpetual frown, gestured to the body. Dr. Mensah, age 58. Found by the housekeeper, Miriam, about an hour ago. No sign of forced entry. Nothing stolen. He hesitated. "But there's something you should see." Zainab followed his gaze to the polished mahogany desk. Carved into the surface, dug deep with what must have been his own shaking hand, was a single word. "Tomorrow." She frowned. "That's all?" Malik nodded grimly. "That's all." The word stood out, jagged and crude against the refined wood. It wasn't the work of a steady hand but one that had been desperate. Struggling. Dying. Zainab's mind immediately began sorting possibilities. Was it a name? A warning? A time frame? Did he know his killer? Did he know he was about to die? She took a breath and turned to the body again. The wound was clean, precise. This wasn't a frenzied attack. This was calculated. Controlled. The housekeeper, Miriam, stood just outside the study, wringing her hands. She was an older woman, her graying hair tied back in a tight bun, her face pale with shock. Zainab approached her. "Miriam, you were the one who found him?" The woman nodded stiffly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came in to bring his tea. He always takes it at the same time." Her voice cracked. "But when I walked in, he was already gone." Zainab studied her carefully. "Did you hear anything? Any voices? Any signs of a struggle?" Miriam shook her head violently. "Nothing. Just silence." The detective glanced at the desk again. "Do you know what he meant by this?" She pointed to the word. Miriam hesitated, her lips pressing together. I don't know." She was lying. Zainab could see it in the way her hands trembled just slightly, how she avoided looking at the carved letters. But now wasn't the time to push. Officer Malik returned, flipping through a small notebook. Dr. Mensah had a son, Adebayo. Estranged. They barely spoke. Then there's Dr. Amakrumah, his business partner. They've been at odds recently over some research. Zainab nodded. "Bring them both in. And check his recent calls, emails, anything that might explain this." She turned back to the word on the desk. "Tomorrow." Whatever it meant, Dr. Mensah had used his last moments to etch it into the wood. And that meant it mattered. Detective Zainab Okoro tapped her pen against the edge of the desk, staring at the word carved into the wood. Tomorrow. The letters were crude, uneven, written by a man who knew he was dying. The deeper she looked at them, the more uneasy she felt. What was he trying to say? She turned her focus to the suspects. The first one sat across from her now, Adebayo Mensah, the victim's only son. He was a tall man in his early 30s, with sharp cheekbones and tired eyes. He looked nothing like a grieving son. If anything, he looked restless, impatient. "You didn't have the best relationship with your father," Zainab began. "Why?" Adebayo snorted. "The real question is, who did have a good relationship with him. He leaned back, arms crossed. The great Dr. Mensah, always obsessed with his research, never had time for anything else. Zainab watched him carefully. When was the last time you saw him? Adebayo hesitated, then sighed. Last night. That caught her attention. You were at the house? Yes. I stopped by unannounced. Wanted to talk. He ran a hand over his face. I thought maybe. I don't know. Maybe we could fix things. Zainab kept her expression neutral. And how did that go? Adebayo let out a bitter laugh. Same as always. He barely looked at me, said he was busy. He told me to come back tomorrow. His voice was tight, bitter. Guess I'll have to reschedule. Zainab's grip on her pen tightened. That word again. You left after that? Yes. A pause. I swear. Zainab studied him for a moment longer. He wasn't lying, at least, not about that. Still, the timing was too perfect. She dismissed Adebayo and moved on to the next suspect, Dr. Amma Kruma. Amma was the victim's research partner, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. Unlike Adebayo, she showed no signs of grief. What were you and Dr. Mensah working on? Zainab asked. Amma's lips curled into a knowing smile. I assume you've already been given the official answer? Zainab raised an eyebrow. And is there an unofficial answer? Amma leaned forward. Kwame was trying to prove something impossible. He believed he had cracked something that would change how we see the mind. What do you mean? Amma's smile disappeared. He thought the human mind could see the future. Zainab frowned. Like premonitions? Not exactly. He believed that what we call déjà vu, that eerie feeling that you've seen something before, isn't just a trick of the brain. He thought it was real. That we experience glimpses of the future but don't understand them. Zainab tried to process that. And you? Amma scoffed. I told him it was dangerous. But he wouldn't stop. Said he was close. Zainab crossed her arms. Close to what? Amma hesitated. Proving it. A chill ran down Zainab's spine. Mensah had spent his life trying to prove the human mind could see the future. And his final message, the word he carved before dying, was tomorrow. What had he seen? Had he seen his own death? Zainab stood. Where were you last night? Amma didn't flinch. At home. And before you ask, I don't need to kill anyone over a debate. Maybe. But something wasn't right. Zainab moved on to the last person on her list, Miriam, the housekeeper. Miriam had been the one to find Mensah's body. But Zainab hadn't forgotten the way her hands had trembled when she saw the word on the desk. Now, as Miriam sat in the interrogation room, she looked even more nervous. You said you didn't hear anything last night, Zainab said. Are you sure? Miriam's gaze darted to the side. Yes. Lying. Zainab leaned in. You recognized the word, didn't you? Tomorrow. Miriam's breath hitched. Zainab's voice softened. Miriam. If there's something you know, now is the time to say it. Miriam hesitated, then, finally, she whispered, Dr. Mensah received a letter the night he died. Zainab's pulse quickened. A letter? From who? I don't know. But when he read it, Miriam swallowed. He went pale. Like he had seen a ghost. Zainab's mind raced. A mysterious letter. A theory about glimpses of the future. A word carved into a desk. None of it made sense, yet. But she was getting closer. And she had a terrible feeling that the answer would change everything. Detective Zainab Okoro sat at her desk, staring at the evidence board. The word tomorrow was pinned in the center, surrounded by the faces of the three people who had last seen Dr. Kwesi Mensah alive: Adebayo Mensah, the estranged son; Dr. Ama Krumah, the skeptical research partner; and Miriam, the frightened housekeeper. And now, a new piece of the puzzle: the mysterious letter. Miriam had been hesitant, but she had finally admitted that Dr. Mensah had received a letter the night of his murder. A letter that had made his blood run cold. Zainab needed to find that letter. She was back at the Mensah estate within the hour, moving quickly through the dimly lit study where the doctor had died. The scent of old paper and dried blood lingered in the air. The desk was still cluttered with books, loose notes, and unfinished manuscripts. Zainab carefully sifted through them, looking for anything that stood out. Then, in one of the drawers, she found it. A sealed envelope, torn open at the top. She pulled out the letter inside, her breath catching as she read the first line. "You already know the question. Tomorrow, you will have the answer." Her stomach twisted. It was unsigned. No sender. No explanation. Just a cryptic message predicting Dr. Mensah's fate. Her mind reeled. Was this a warning? A threat? Or was it something worse, something Dr. Mensah had believed? Zainab turned to Officer Malik, who had been scanning the bookshelves. "Get this to forensics. I want fingerprints, handwriting analysis, anything." Malik took the letter carefully. "What do you think it means?" Zainab exhaled slowly. "I think someone wanted him to know he was going to die before it happened." The son's truth. Adebayo Mensah sat stiffly in the interrogation room, arms crossed, his jaw tight. "Do you recognize this letter?" Zainab slid a copy across the table. Adebayo barely glanced at it. "No." Zainab studied him. "Your father told you to come back tomorrow," the same word he carved into his desk before he died. "And now, we find this letter, telling him he would get his answer tomorrow." Adebayo frowned but said nothing. Zainab leaned forward. "Did you send this letter?" His eyes flared with anger. "No. I don't play mind games, detective." Zainab tapped her pen against the table. "You had a rocky relationship with your father. You visited him the night before he died. You admitted that he dismissed you, just like always." Adebayo's fists clenched. "Yes. But I didn't kill him." "Then help me understand." She folded her hands together. "Why did he tell you to come back tomorrow?" Adebayo hesitated. For the first time, his anger dimmed, replaced by something else: uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted. But, he seemed distracted. Like he had something important on his mind. Zainab nodded. That matched what Miriam had said. The letter had shaken him. Adebayo exhaled, rubbing his forehead. He was always talking about seeing things before they happened. He used to say, "The question is more important than the answer." Zainab's eyes narrowed. "What question?" Adebayo shook his head. "I never understood." But he believed the universe was built on questions. And if you asked the right one at the right time, you'd see the answer before it arrived. A chill ran down Zainab's spine. The partner's warning. Zainab's next stop was Dr. Ama Krumah. Ama sat with perfect posture, her sharp eyes watching Zainab like a scientist studying a specimen. "You said Dr. Mensah believed in glimpses of the future," Zainab began. "What exactly was he working on?" Ama tilted her head. "I already told you. He thought déjà vu wasn't just a trick of the brain, it was real. A glimpse into what's about to happen." "And did he prove it?" Ama's lips curled into a humorless smile. "That depends on what you consider proof." Zainab's patience thinned. "Just tell me what he discovered." Ama exhaled. "He started an experiment. He would ask himself a question, something simple, like, what will I see when I step outside tomorrow? And then he would write down whatever came to mind. A word, an image, anything. Zainab frowned. And? Amma hesitated. And the next day, he would see it. Almost every time. Zainab's fingers tensed. That's impossible. Amma leaned forward. Is it? Zainab swallowed. You're telling me he could predict the future? Amma's expression darkened. Not predict. Glance at it. A cold shiver crawled up Zainab's spine. Dr. Mensah had spent his life asking questions. And if he had asked the right question before his death, had he seen it coming? Had he seen his own murder? The housekeeper's fear. Zainab's final stop was Miriam. The housekeeper was trembling when she sat down across from the detective. I told you everything, she whispered. No, you didn't. Zainab's voice was firm. You knew about the letter. And you know more about what Dr. Mensah was afraid of. Miriam's lip quivered. I heard him talking to himself. Zainab's breath caught. Talking about what? Miriam clenched her hands together. He kept saying the same thing over and over. Zainab leaned in. What did he say? Miriam took a shaky breath. The question has been asked. The answer is coming. The answer is coming, tomorrow. Zainab's blood turned to ice. Mensah had asked a question. And he had seen the answer. His own death. Her voice was barely a whisper. Did he say what the question was? Miriam shook her head. But Zainab already knew. Dr. Mensah had looked into the future. And the question he had asked before he died was terrifyingly simple. How will I die? And tomorrow, the answer had come. Zainab's hands curled into fists. If Dr. Mensah had seen his death, then the real question remained. Had he seen his killer's face? Detective Zainab Okoro sat alone in her dimly lit office, replaying every piece of the puzzle in her mind. Dr. Kwesi Mensah had asked a question. A question that revealed his own death before it happened. And if he had seen the answer, he had also seen who killed him. She grabbed her pen and circled the one word that had appeared over and over again. Tomorrow. Tomorrow had arrived. And now, it was time to confront the killer. The first suspect, Adebayo Mensah. Zainab found Adebayo Mensah pacing outside his father's estate, his frustration clear in the way his hands clenched and unclenched. You again, he muttered as she approached. We need to talk. Zainab's voice was sharp. About your father's death. Adebayo scoffed. Haven't we gone through this already? Zainab folded her arms. You told me your father was obsessed with glimpses of the future. And that he used questions to see what would happen next. Adebayo nodded stiffly. So tell me, why would he ask a question about his own death? Adebayo hesitated, his expression unreadable. Because he was scared. Of what? His jaw tightened. Of the truth. Zainab studied him. What truth? Adebayo took a deep breath. My father, he wasn't just playing with ideas. He was testing them. He started asking bigger questions, things he shouldn't have. Zainab's eyes narrowed. Like what? Adebayo glanced around, his voice dropping to a whisper. Like who wanted him dead? The second suspect, Dr. Amma Kruma. Amma's expression didn't change. I didn't send that letter. But you knew what he was working on, Zainab pressed. And you knew it was dangerous. Amma leaned back, folding her hands together. Detective, do you believe in fate? Zainab frowned. I believe in facts. Amma's lips curled into a knowing smile. Then here's a fact for you, if Dr. Mensah saw his death before it happened, it means one of two things. She held up one finger. 1. His vision was real, and he was doomed the moment he asked the question. Then a second finger. Or 2. Someone knew he would ask and made sure the vision came true. Zainab stiffened. Amma tilted her head. The real question isn't who killed him. She leaned forward, voice low. It's who made him ask the question in the first place. The third suspect, Miriam. The housekeeper Miriam was waiting for Zainab this time, as if she knew she was coming. I told you everything I know, Miriam said, wringing her hands. No, Zainab said coldly. You didn't. Miriam's eyes darted to the door. Please, detective, I don't. Zainab slammed a torn notebook page onto the table. Miriam flinched. It was a handwritten note, scrawled in frantic, uneven strokes. Tomorrow, I will know the truth. Zainab leaned in. This was found in Dr. Mensah's study. It's his handwriting. And it means that before he died, he knew something. Something important. Miriam shook her head violently. I don't know anything about that. Zainab's voice sharpened. I think you do. Miriam swallowed hard. Zainab took a deep breath, lowering her tone. It was about why he had to die. The truth beneath the question. Zainab sat in her car, staring at the notebook page. Tomorrow, I will know the truth. The answer had been there all along. Dr. Mensah had asked a question. Mensah's death wasn't a murder of passion. It wasn't about revenge. It was a design. Someone had orchestrated the perfect crime, by using Dr. Mensah's own mind against him. And when Zainab finally pieced it together, one name rose above the rest. The one person who knew exactly what Dr. Mensah was working on. The one person who understood how his experiments worked. The one person who could predict how he would react. Zainab's hands clenched into fists. She knew the killer. Detective Zainab Okoro sat in the interrogation room, staring across the table at the person who had orchestrated Dr. Mensah's death. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock. You planned this, she said, her voice dangerously calm. Across from her, Dr. Amma Kruma folded her hands neatly on the table. Her dark brown eyes revealed nothing. I don't know what you mean, Amma said coolly. Zainab exhaled, shaking her head. Oh, I think you do. She placed Dr. Mensah's torn notebook page on the table, the one with his final, haunting words. Tomorrow, I will know the truth. Zainab tapped it. He wrote this before he died. And I know why. Amma tilted her head slightly. Enlighten me. Zainab leaned forward. You didn't just predict his death. You made him predict it. The perfect crime. Zainab's voice was steady as she laid out the truth. For years, Dr. Mensah was obsessed with questions about the future. He believed that asking the right question could reveal what was coming next. Amma remained silent. But his ability wasn't perfect, Zainab continued. The answer was only as good as the question. And that's where you came in. A flicker of something passed through Amma's eyes. You didn't just kill him, Zainab said. You manipulated him into seeing his own death. You led him to ask a question that ensured his fate. Amma smirked slightly. That's an interesting theory. Zainab placed another piece of evidence on the table. A recording. She pressed play. Dr. Mensah's voice crackled through the room. What happens if I die tomorrow? A long pause. Then a soft, female voice responded. Then tomorrow, you will see the truth. Amma's smirk vanished. Zainab pressed pause. Recognize that voice? Amma was silent. It's yours, Zainab said. You planted that question in his mind. You led him to ask it. And once he asked. She gestured at the notebook page. Tomorrow, I will know the truth. He walked straight into his own death. The final piece of the puzzle. Amma exhaled through her nose, a slow, measured breath. Then she finally spoke. You're a clever detective, she admitted. Zainab's stomach twisted at the calmness in Amma's voice. I'll take that as a confession, Zainab said. Amma smiled faintly. But do you know why I did it? Zainab's jaw clenched. Why? Amma leaned forward, voice low. Because he had already seen his death before. Zainab blinked. Amma's smile widened. Dr. Mensah's ability was real. And weeks ago, he accidentally saw a vision of his own murder. Zainab's pulse pounded. That's not possible. If he saw it, he could have avoided it. Amma chuckled softly. Not if the vision itself wasn't complete. Zainab frowned. Amma continued, the moment he saw something, he needed to know more. He needed to know exactly what would happen. That's why I made him ask the right question. Zainab realized the horrifying truth. Dr. Mensah had unknowingly triggered his own fate. Once he saw his death, his mind couldn't let it go. He kept asking questions. Kept searching for the missing pieces. And Amma had guided him to the final question. What happens if I die tomorrow? Once he asked that, he had no choice but to walk into it. The shocking truth. Zainab stared at Amma. You're saying he killed himself? Amma shrugged. Not directly. But his belief in his own question led him to his death. She leaned back. I just made sure the answer came true. Zainab felt a cold weight settle in her chest. Amma had orchestrated the perfect murder. She didn't stab Dr. Mensah. She didn't poison him. She simply made him believe that his death was inevitable. And that belief killed him. Zainab tightened her grip on the table. You're still going to prison. Amma chuckled. For what? Telling a man what he already believed? Zainab's stomach turned. Amma was right. She hadn't physically murdered Dr. Mensah. She had simply guided his mind toward a conclusion. Would a jury convict her? Would they even understand what she had done? Amma leaned forward again, her voice like silk. Detective, tell me, what happens if you fail to convict me? Zainab inhaled sharply. And for the first time in her life, she was terrified of the answer.